everyone, and welcome to part 2 in parts of the nervous system. Within part 1, we ended off talking about, how neurons are composed and how they're connected and how they send messages. Well, now we're going to look at them on a broader scale and how they make up our nervous system, these connections. Now, the parts of the nervous system, we're going to look at the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. These both jointly make up our nervous system, but they can be divided. The nervous system can be divided amongst itself in terms of all of the different roles and responsibilities it has for our body. The central nervous system will consist of what's central to the body, so your brain and your spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is going to look at everything else. Now, when we have that peripheral nervous system, we are going to talk about it being further subdivided. I know there's a lot of trees and branching off within this picture, but stay with me, between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So with the autonomic nervous system, think automatic. These are things that are done throughout our body that we don't have to think about, mainly communication with internal organs and glands. So this is your breathing, your sweating, your pupil dilation, all that type of stuff. Now, you have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division is what's going to gear our body for arousal. Now, this is not speaking in terms of sexual arousal, although that could be a part of it. We're talking about arousal in general. This is stimulating, sometimes stress response. This is where we see the fight or flight or freeze or fawn response. Formerly known as the fight or flight response. So whether someone, their reaction to a stressor, are they going to fight it? Are they going to run away from it? Are they going to freeze in that moment? Or are they going to fawn, which is usually following the order of someone else? It's a very dependent type stress response. But those stress responses fall under the sympathetic division. This is our body gearing us up for whatever decision we make, or whatever response we exhibit, because we don't really think about how we're going to react to stress. If I see a snake and I'm going on a hike, my body is going to react. Okay? I'm not telling my body, okay, time to sweat, time to dilate my pupils, time to raise my heart rate. No, it's going to react based on what I'm seeing. And it's using my body's resources to gear me up for whatever response I'm going to do, which I'm probably going to flee. I'm probably going to run. Right? Our parasympathetic division, which automatically kind of works within that autonomic nervous system, is going to calm us or bring us back down from that arousal. So, if our heart rate was escalating and we're using our energy resources to confront a stressor, it's going to bring our heart rate back down. It's going to, stop that sweating that we're doing. It's going to lower our blood pressure. It's going to lower our temperature, because our temperature does get raised when we're under stress sometimes. So the parasympathetic division its main goal is restoring those resources, because you can't consistently be in a state of high arousal. It would burn up all your energy. So the parasympathetic nervous system comes in to restore those levels. And that's the autonomic nervous system in a nutshell. Now with the somatic nervous system, we have the sensory nervous system as well as the motor nervous system. So sensory input, motor output. These key terms will kind of demonstrate to you where the signal or the neuron, that action potential, is going to move. So sensory input, that means it's going from the body to the brain. So when you touch something, that sensation is going through my hand, through my arm, up all the way to my central nervous system, my spinal cord, up to my brain for processing, figuring out what it is, sorting it out accordingly. If I smell something, my brain is going to take that in, and the thalamus is the relay center is say, hey, you know what, that's a stinky smell, let's send that to the olfactory region, okay? The motor neurons, it says motor output. That's because the signal is going out from your brain. If you decide that you're going to move your arms, your brain is going to send a signal through that central nervous system to your peripheral nervous system to your arms so you can move them, and so I can do all these crazy notions when I move my hands, right? That is the difference between that somatic nervous system. So those two differentiations are both how we communicate with our sense organs and our voluntary muscles. So those are the key differences between the autonomic and somatic. Think soma as in body. So think of like body parts and how we move them, our voluntary muscles, riding a bike, those types of tasks. And that's it for 3.3. So let's move on to the brain and spinal cord, because there's a lot to break down here. First off, the spinal cord, it has a lot, you see all these vertebrae are those bones stacked onto each other, right? That makes up the cord, which protects the bundle of nerve fibers, the actual cord itself. Those vertebrae, connective vertebrae, protect the spinal cord. There are 30 segments with corresponding vertebrae. You have some reflexes located within your spinal cord, which is great. It helps save reaction times, okay? So what does that mean? It means that signal doesn't necessarily need to move to your brain if your body is in pain. For example, maybe there are some spinal reflexes to help with some self-preservation, to cut the time that it takes to take that signal to your brain, as opposed to just straight to that thoracic region. I don't think that's the word. We'll say straight to that region on your spinal cord. Now, this spinal cord is like the highway to and from your brain, right? The signals are going to travel along the cord to your brain and away from your brain. That's what we talked about with the afferent and efferent signals. The efferent signals are your motor signals. Afferent are your sensory signals going towards the brain. Think efferent exit, the signals exiting your brain. But with spinal cord damage, sometimes this happens. Usually the lower the injury on the spinal cord, the fewer functions are inhibited. So if someone's going to have a spinal cord injury, it's usually a better prognosis. It's all relative, but a better prognosis the lower it is on the cord as opposed to higher. And it inhibits less functions. Because think about, where on your spinal cord different signals are coming in. Using of our arms and our hands is going to be higher up as opposed to our legs. So it's a very important part of our nervous system. It's going to be central, that central highway. Then we have hemispheres of the brain. So this is what we talked about with the left brain and the right brain myth that I discussed. The left brain is going to control your language, and it controls the right side of your body. The right brain controls your the left side of your body and your visual hemisphere. So the hemispheres of the brain control the opposite side of your body. And the left brain is more talking about language, so people associated with higher order thinking, logic, and thought processes. And the right brain is more visual, so that's why people think it's the more artsy part of your brain. But in reality, there is a signal. Let me break this down. This picture right here is if we are looking behind someone and x-raying through their skull. Okay, so let's look. No, I'm sorry. This is a front view. I thought it was a back view. Excuse me. So front view. This is if we're looking towards someone and we're just seeing straight through to their brain. So you see that there are these gyri and sulci on the brain. Gyri are just grooves, and sulci are the dips or the valleys, those little lines that go in. And the grooves are up top, that chunky part. That's very scientific. The largest sulcus is the longitudinal fissure right here. So it gives the brain the appearance that it's kind of disconnected at the top. As you'll see in this far right picture, that's a picture of a lamb brain. So if we were to kind of spread that sulcus, you could see that you have the left and right hemispheres, and this large bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. That corpus callosum, that's right here in this image, that is going to send signals to the different parts of your brain so that you can process them. So when you're reading something and trying to visualize something, maybe you're reading a book and you're visualizing the characters, you're processing the language, with that left side of your hemisphere, but you're also processing like the visual information with the right. So it's going to go back and forth through that bridge, okay? That's very important. And this image of the brain, of the sheep brain, this is like the hind brain. So that's the back of the brain. So back of the brain, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, front. I just thought it was kind of cool they had a real image. But yes, that corpus callosum is very important. Now, there are people who have had that severed, cut in half. That's in very extreme cases of like epilepsy, where people, keep having seizures and they can't control the electrical impulses in the brain with medication or other means. And they've done perfectly fine. You can still live if it's cut. It's just some functions are inhibited, like the collaboration between the right and left hemisphere for processing visual and language information at the same time. Now, the lobes of the brain. The lobes of the brain are how we divide the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is all this stuff on top. It kind of looks like a sausage. I know, that's not very scientific. But it's all of that material on top of the brain. That's your cerebral cortex. This contains your lobes. Now your lobes, each different part of the cerebral cortex is going to have a different type of function. So you have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. And I recommend like chanting that to yourself. It helps you remember. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. My psych professor made me do it over and over again, and I will never forget that because it was just repetitive. But major functions of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is where all of your major like reasoning and logic processes happen. Your frontal lobe doesn't develop until you're like in your young adulthood, like fully develop. And so, you know, the processes within it, that's why we say to be like lenient with children. They're still developing their logic, right? Many people have their frontal lobe developed and are in a higher order of reasoning processes, right? It can vary based on the individual and the skills and that they've refined and how they exercise the brain, because it is an organ you have to exercise. But that frontal lobe is going to be responsible for reasoning, motor control, emotion, and language. So you have the motor cortex housed within the frontal lobe. Think motor as in movement. Your prefrontal cortex is going to be a higher level cognitive function. So your logic, you know, what you use when you're doing a psych assignment. And then you're going to have Broca's area. This is important for language production. So think Broca, you know, in Spanish and Italian, the word for mouth is boca. So maybe it'll help you to say boca because you speak out of your mouth. Broca's area helps you with language production. So all of these parts kind of work together. Think about the prefrontal cortex and how you're reasoning, right? And then you're going to produce the actual speech to talk about what you're thinking about. But that's the frontal lobe. Next we have the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. So the parietal lobe's over here. This houses the somatosensory cortex, which is going to help you process sensory information from across your body. That's going to take in those afferent neuron signals to the brain for processing. The occipital lobe, if you think of ocular, it means eye. Right? So the occipital lobe, if you've ever been hit in the back of the head so hard that you like blacked out, that's because you hit your visual cortex, the space that processes your visual information. It's very important. And then the temporal lobe, think of temple, it's close to your ears. So it helps with your hearing, your memory, emotion, and some language. So their auditory cortex is housed within that temporal lobe. And it helps with some language because it houses Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is kind of like the pairing of Broca's area. Wernicke's area helps you with speech comprehension, which makes sense because you're listening and understanding using that temporal lobe. I'm going to pause this video right here. Stay tuned for part 3.